P.K. Mishra, sir, and he would be giving a lecture on the management of periampullary cancer evidence-based. So, sir, please welcome. I welcome you on the behalf of GIDMG of Max Saket, and please, discuss the nitty-gritties. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shefali. So is my screen visible now?
Yes, absolutely.
So thank you, Dr. Shefali, and thank you for introduction. I am Dr. P.K. Mishra, and I'm Director and HOD of Surgical Gastroenterology at Max PPG and Vaishali. So I will be talking about periampullary carcinoma. Now, periampullary carcinoma is a set of carcinomas which is defined as within 2 centimeters of the ampulla. So this is a diverse group which has pancreatic carcinoma, lower end cholangiocarcinoma, ampullary carcinoma, and duodenal carcinomas. Now, this diverse group has some of the things, some of the features in common, which is common presentation with jaundice and a palpable gallbladder mostly, and it has similar kind of imaging, although there are various differences. It is again treated and palliated very similarly, although there's difference in prognosis, which we will be talking about later. So in this talk, I'll be covering a little bit on etiology and pathogenesis, symptoms and presentation. I will talk about investigations, including the imaging features, and then biliary drainage, biopsy confirmation, surgical treatment I'll be speaking about, and minimal access surgery. I have included a few slides to discuss about. Then neoadjuvant and adjuvant treatment, I would just briefly touch about, because this is an area where the experts are here. I think that can be taken up in the discussions later on. Now, this is, I am told, last of the lecture in this series, and plenty of pancreatic tumors have been covered. Classical versus PP, PD, PG versus PJ, SMA first, borderline pancreas, then neoadjuvant treatment, operative details have all been discussed earlier. So I'll try to limit myself in these areas. So talking about etiopathogenesis, smoking has been implicated, and the other culprit, alcohol, of course, and the smoking has 75% increase compared to the non-smokers. Then alcohol has a risk increase, which is independent of smoking and also of acute pancreatitis. Then diabetes mellitus, again, 1.5 to 2 times increased risk is there. Then we have obesity, chronic pancreatitis. These are all known risk factors. Then infection H. pylori has some influence on host-immune pathway, and therefore this is also one of the culprits. 10% of the periampullary carcinoma have been shown to have some kind of genetic basis, BRCA2 genes, PRSS1, P16, and HNPCC have been implicated in the causation of periampullary carcinomas in various studies. So compared to the pancreatic head or uncinate or body cancers, periampullary carcinomas, they appear earlier because they would obstruct the biliary channel faster, and the hallmark is a painless progressive kind of jaundice. Waxing and waning has been described in these tumors, but occurs only in very few cases, and the reason is that ampullary area becomes necrosed or sloughed off, and there's some relief in jaundice, and then again this jaundice increases. So stools, if we ask these patients, they can be pale, they can be acholic, or they can be silver colored, when heme is also mixed in these patients. So these patients have typically pruritus, and other features that may bring these patients to light is recent onset diabetes mellitus, especially in elderly. Then they may present with cholangitis, metastatic disease, in which cases patient may present with anorexia, ascites, or weight loss. In the examination of these patients, we come across that patient has icterus, palpable gallbladder mostly, and then we have to also look for any signs of spread like ascites, Bloomer shelf, or supraclavicular lymph nodes. So this was typically one of our patients, 45-year-old, and presented with jaundice. Gallbladder was palpable, the skin, the mark of itching is seen over here. And this was diagnosed as periampullary carcinoma. You can see the jaundice over here. So for the benefit of some of our students, I would reiterate over here Courvoisier's law, that in a jaundice patient, if the gallbladder is palpable, it is seldom due to stones. Now, in one of the studies, jaundice with palpable gallbladder, malignant etiology was there in 97%, and jaundice without palpable gallbladder, benign etiology was seen in 80%. The explanation is that due to recurrent cholecystitis, the gallbladder has become shrunken and fibrosed, so therefore it would not be palpable. So what are the laboratory tests that we will do? CBC, KFT, LFT, PT-INR has to be done. Now, if there is any cholangitis, TLC may be raised. Renal functions is important in these patients. LFT would show typically conjugated hyperbilirubinemia with elevated alkaline phosphatase. CA19-9 would be raised in these patients, but this has to be interpreted with caution because in many varieties of obstructive jaundice, the CA19-9 can be raised. Coming to the imaging evaluation, CCT is the workhorse of diagnosis. We want a dedicated fine-cut three-phase pancreas protocol computed tomography, which provides valuable information regarding local spread of the disease. And primarily, we want to see whether vascular involvement is there. And then the regional thing, if there's been any spread to the liver or metastasis of the disease to the lymph nodes. And cross-sectional imaging is important. It will give us the extent, stage, and potential resectability of the disease. So all these information can be gathered by CCT, and the relation with nearby structures should be established. IVC, portal vein, SMA, SMV, celiac trunk, as well as hepatic artery. In patients with deranged KFT or contrast allergy, then we have MRI with MRCP, which can substitute all these things. So this is a photograph that I have borrowed from surgical textbook of surgical gastroenterology. These are the CT pictures. You can see that this is double duct sign over here, and this in the periampullary area, this gets obstructed. CVD is dilated, so is gallbladder over here, and the same thing, double duct sign is seen over here. This is the MRCP picture, and you can also just faintly make out that there is a periampullary carcinoma over here. So this is the resected specimen corresponding to this. And coming to the MRI MRCP, it offers similar kind of picture as CCT. It has some advantages, but it is not as good as CCT for the lymph nodes, vascular delineation, clear-cut anatomy also, and adjoining organs. It can be used when CCT is not available to us for some reason, or as a problem-solving tool, or in a situation where CCT is contraindicated, for example, in contrast allergy or where kidney functions are deranged. Now, these images I have taken from Kim et al., and this is from Journal of Radiographics. In this, the MRCP pictures were analyzed beautifully for all the 4 types, and different types of carcinoma were analyzed with 89 cases or so. Now you can see that this is the tumor over here. This is a graphic representation of these tumors. Both the CBD and the pancreatic duct are prominent, and this is the kind of tumor which is delineated in the cross-sectional imaging. Similarly, another type where this tumor is a pancreatic thing and some distance away from the ampulla, you see this is the obstructed site, this is the site obstruction, and this is depicted over here. This is the pancreatic duct, the bile duct, and this is the site of obstruction. And this is the axial image depicting the same thing. So talking about EUS and PET-CT, these are additional tools available to us. And I must say that their roles are getting increasingly recognized. Their role is evolving at present. EUS can be used where mass lesion is not delineated by the imaging, or there is a diagnostic dilemma whether there is a small stone which is stuck up in the lower end. So for these purposes, the EUS is very good. And also for taking any biopsy or FNAC, especially in settings where the surgery is not going to be done or surgery is going to be delayed. For example, if we have a new adjuvant to be given, or in advanced cases where palliative treatment is to be given or chemotherapy is to be given. So talking about side being endoscopy, ERCP, and biopsy, then biopsy in these patients should be definitely attempted, although it is not mandatory. Now, this is a situation where we have a lot of legal kind of problems, and sometimes patients would not accept that a kind of Whipple's procedure has been done for a disease which was not there, or a benign disease is there. So definite attempt should be made to get a biopsy. However, at the same time, I would say that it is not mandatory. And so suppose a biopsy could not be proven, so it should, the chance of cure for a patient should not be lost. So biopsy should be attempted, although it is not mandatory. ERCP can be used to obtain brush cytology, and biopsy stenting should be done if required. Our indications for stenting are that mandatory stenting in case patient has cholangitis, coagulation defects are there, or there's renal impairment. Then relatively, if patient's operation is going to be delayed, then patient may have mounting bilirubin levels and liver dysfunction may be there. Whether it is delayed for nutrition or it is delayed for neoadjuvant therapy, then these patients should also undergo stenting. Then if bilirubin is above 15 milligram and we stent these patients, this cutoff, I agree, is arbitrary, but this is based on our experience of risk perception in these patients, and at least partially it is supported by literature. If we stent these patients, the infective complications are increased, but the coagulation and the renal complications are certainly decreased. Talking of PET scan, there is certainly no definite advantage of PET over MDCT in evaluation of a head mass. There's definitely cost involved, and there is issue about false positives coming over there. And therefore, we would not routinely recommend this. PET may be indicated if staging and detection of occult metastasis is required. We are dealing with recurrent disease and it has to be, or monitoring of chemotherapies to be done. Then distant metastasis, lymph node involvement, if it is an advanced kind of disease, PET can be done. Then in some problem-solving situations where CT fails to identify mass in the pancreatic head or FNA has been non-diagnostic, there also PET may be used in selected cases. I have just included one slide on local resection. Local resection is not practiced, and I think I have done only one local resection. I haven't seen any, only one other being done, but this is a possibility. Possible thing is there at T0, T1 kind of lesions, and mainly for benign adenomas, local resections can be done. But problem over here is that it is difficult to distinguish between benign and malignant lesions on endoscopic biopsies, and also the lymph node part would be a problem. So this is associated with high recurrence and not recommended except in patients who are unsuitable for a major operation. But even local resections have a lot of problems. Then surgical treatment. We do a standard classical Whipples with the lymph nodes all removed to the right of SMA. And literature says that minimum of 15 lymph nodes should be removed in a standard Whipples. As far as existing literature is concerned, no particular benefits of pylorus preserving pancreaticoduodenectomy. In fact, in bulky pancreatic tumors, classical Whipple's pancreaticoduodenectomy may be oncologically advantageous. Some disadvantages have been proposed for both these procedures, which I would not be going into the detail. Extended lymphadenopathy, it has no real oncological benefit. Probably if the lymph nodes are spread and positive beyond this resection area that we have talked about, then probably chemotherapy is the best way to help these patients, or chemoradiotherapy may be required. Then lots of controversies has been regarding drains, and it's very simple to put in drain, although some people have said that drains have caused a little more problems in some of the series. But we are not convinced as yet, and we use 2 drains and remove them guided by DFA and effluent volume in our post-op patients. So this is a patient who has undergone Whipple's pancreaticoduodenectomy, classical. This is the SMB portal vein. This is the SMA, and this is the IVC and renal vein over here. You can see that whole of this area is cleared. This is a bile duct, which is to be anastomosed. Right hepatic artery. This is the hepatic artery proper and common hepatic artery, and this is the portal vein that you see over here. This is the resected specimen. This is a gallbladder attached to the bile duct. This is the antrum part of the stomach. This is the duodenum, and this is the pancreatic part, which is attached over here. This is the opened up specimen. You can see the ampullary tumor. When I was resident at All India Institute, we used to do dunking procedure for anastomosis, and I was not very happy about it afterwards when we were practicing this kind of anastomosis, and we did variety of anastomosis at that time. 2002, I got a chance to be observer at Sloan Kettering with Professor Blumgard, and I learned this Blumgard's anastomosis, which I partially modified in my practice. And 2003 onwards, we are doing this Blumgard's anastomosis. This has served us well, and this is the technique that we use. And these are typically used sutures with 3-0-proline. This is going through the whole of the pancreas, coming back and back through whole of the pancreas, and the needle is left over there, right? Then after applying 2 to 3 sutures on either side of the duct, then we do a duct to mucosa kind of anastomosis with the jejunum. The needles are left attached over here. Then this duct to mucosa anastomosis is done over here. And this we published for our first 100 cases of Blumgard's anastomosis. And then these are tied over here. This is duct to mucosa anastomosis. In our initial days, we are using the stent, which we have discarded since. And then this is a completed anastomosis over this. And this has served us well. Our leak rate is somewhere around 15%, and most of these are grade A according to IGPC definitions, and about 7% B and C grade leaks we have been encountering. So we had analyzed our first 100 cases. 2 into the duct could not be identified, and we had to do dunking. So 98 finally were analyzed. So this is the procedure. Operatively, it is being seen. See this U kind of sutures, and this is seromuscular suture. Back again, these are proline sutures, 2 to 3 on either side of this duct. You can see the duct. This is pancreas, and this is a jejunum. Then these have been applied on both sides. The advantage is that the sutures, which goes through the whole of the pancreas, it has less chances of cutting through. And then the duct to mucosa anastomosis is now to be done over here. Duct to mucosa anastomosis completed. Then we tie the sutures that we have taken previously. And then after tying these, then we put the second layer with the same sutures. And there's a slight modification that we use, that we do not go through the pancreas, and some other small modifications. And we have been using this anastomosis, and a lot of residents who trained with us have been using this anastomosis to good effect, and this has served us well. But it is like, say, my car is better than your car or something, and people can be using different anastomosis. And the thing is that you should get used to one anastomosis which serves you well, and you should keep practicing that, do it well, and this has served us well. So these were our results. So I have told already that grade A kind of leaks were 8% or so, and B and C were about 7%. And at that time in the literature, it was kind of comparable to Cleespies or Grobmaier's series also. And all the other series which are published, which were not doing Bloom-Gart anastomosis, it was in fact better than the other series at that time. So this was in 2010 that we had published this. Subsequently, we have been using in our, since then, for the last 10 years, we have been continuing to use the same. So coming to the pathology, most of our tumors are ampullary in nature, and we get to see more of periampullary carcinomas rather than pancreatic head carcinomas. And if you see the Western data, the pancreatic is about 50% or more, 56% over here, ampullary is 25%, biliary is 15%, and duodenal cases are about 4%. So duodenal is the rarest. And if you see that pancreatic cancers would have highest nodal involvement, microvascular invasion, as well as neural invasion. So the prognosis for the pancreatic carcinoma is the worst, followed by biliary, and then followed by ampullary and duodenal carcinomas. So if you see in pancreatic carcinomas, the positive margins is 37%, whereas for ampullary carcinoma, it is 7%. For perhaps this reason, our results in periampullary carcinomas have been quite good, and we see 50 to 60% 5-year survival compared to only 20% survival in pancreatic head cancers that is more often seen in the West. So we had analyzed recently our adenocarcinomas in the periampullary region, and our ampullary tumors comprised almost 61% of our cases, and cholangiocarcinoma was 18.7%, duodenal 11.5%, and pancreatic adenocarcinomas were 8.1% in our analysis at that time. So talking about minimal access and robotic surgeries, laparoscopy and robotic surgery have been seen to be feasible and safe in selected cases by highly trained surgeons in both open and minimal access surgery. And in fact, Palani Velu's group has shown that the level of skills that can be achieved. So this is certainly possible, can be done, and it is feasible for selected cases. But if we talk about its equivalence or non-inferior to open, we do not have the data till now, and long-term oncological data is remaining. In fact, the lymph node yields, etc., and the minimal access groups have been less, and certainly it is not superior to this. So in Whipple's pancreaticoduodenectomy, what is at issue? Is it the time taken for operation? I would certainly say no. Or is it 1 to 3 days of hospital stay? Is it about 8 centimeters of incision or 16 centimeters of incision or cosmesis? Or it is 20, 50 or 100 ml of blood loss? I would say that my reference point for this kind of operation is a major operation, and is only one thing, that is survival. Survival is the most important thing. And then I would also say that operative mortality should be considered for these patients. So it is feasible, alternative in selected cases, no evidence to show superiority. Most complications relate to complex surgery and pancreato-jejunal anastomosis rather than the abdominal incision. And accelerated protocols have shown increased readmissions. Which is
I would request everyone to mute so that sir can proceed nicely. Please mute yourself.
Hello.
Sir, please proceed. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. So there is a, do I have time? I think I have 4-5 slides more.
Yeah, sir, please proceed.
Okay. So other thing is that there's a long learning curve which is involved in these patients. And it has been determined that in the initial phases, there may be, in fact, a lot of morbidity and mortality, and 30 to 60 cases have been shown as the learning curve for these kind of complex cases. So potential problems are, it is technically demanding because of retroperitoneal location, complicated anastomotic components. There's steep learning curve. There's lack of tactile feedback. Then there's critical vasculature. Then disruption of tumor planes may be there. It has also potential for rapid high volume hemorrhage at times, and specific conversion plans are necessary. Absence of long-term oncological outcomes remain the biggest thing right now, but probably soon it should be available. And there are paucity of really well-designed prospective studies. There are only 2 randomized trials, and they have a lot of shortcomings. So there is lack of robust cost-benefit analysis as well. So talking about, these are my last few slides, neoadjuvant therapy. The advantages spoken for neoadjuvant therapy is that there is high risk of undiagnosed stage 4 kind of disease, which may be seen in 15 to 30%. Then neoadjuvant therapy can convert locally unresectable disease to a resectable disease. Then preoperative radiation is more effective, more well tolerated. Preoperative selection, this can work as a preoperative selection tool in patients with marginal candidacy for surgery. Then it has been said in various studies that there's increase in margin negative resection rate. Most patients will receive some form of chemotherapy or radiation, as opposed to a large number being denied because of post-operative complications in this kind of a large procedure, Whipple's procedure, where up to 40% morbidity is seen in these patients. So, but although neoadjuvant CRT is most studied in resectable disease, but have no well-defined role in this setting, defined role in borderline resectable disease and unresectable disease is there. So, but more data needs to be collected for resectable disease, and we do not follow neoadjuvant for resectable disease as of now. Then adjuvant therapy has been undergoing a great change. There has been translational research, and it is generating new windows of diagnostic and therapeutic opportunities. And mRNA and microRNA based markers have been developed, which lead to earlier diagnosis. Molecular profiling in histopathological subtypes of intestinal and pancreatobiliary types have been done. Then biomarker-based trials have now started appearing, and then markers of metastasis are being recognized according to which, so specific disease therapy plans can be individualized. So this is these are some of the recent important trials, and if we see that addition of capecitabine has increased the survival in many patients, which is the unexpectedly increased survival is seen in many of these patients. Then in cases of even metastatic pancreatic ductal carcinoma, FOLFIRINOX-based regimes have shown 11-month kind of median survival, and these are kind of augurs well for the patients with metastatic disease and with advanced disease. And in future, I think we may have more favorable kind of chemotherapeutic and adjuvant regimes to offer these patients. So thank you very much. So that was all that I had to say on this. I hand you back to Dr. Nikhil.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And it was a very comprehensive presentation, especially from the point of view of students, where you have covered mostly important things. A couple of thoughts which are coming in my mind. One is about the leak rate. So, like generally, we think that periampullary cancers, excluding pancreas, has a higher leak rate. So what's your thought on that? Non-dilated duct, soft pancreas.
See, periampullary, in our study also, two factors which were important were, one was soft pancreas and the other was a duct. We had used 3 millimeter cutoff, 3 millimeter above and below 3 millimeter ducts. So these two were the most important factors which determined the leak rate in our patients. Periampullary carcinomas where the duct is dilated, like ampullary carcinomas, so they would have better chances of not having leak. And yes, lower end cholangiocarcinomas with soft pancreas, smaller ducts, they may have increased amount of leak rate. So overall, our leak rate has been comparatively manageable and mostly A or B kind of leaks, which we have encountered, even in small pancreas, soft pancreas.
Second question, which again not very relevant from a student's point of view, but see, generally pancreatic carcinoma, we say that biopsy is, I mean, FNAC is not required, especially in resectable disease. Now, same happens with ampullary cancers. I mean, we are tempted to take biopsy in these patients preoperatively because it's easier to get. But the thing is that some of these biopsies will turn out to be negative, and then it's very difficult to convince these patients to undergo surgery. So I totally agree with your statement that it should be attempted, and all of us practice the same. But my question is a big why there.
Yes, you have made a very valid point. But with this kind of atmosphere that we are now gradually going into litigation and all those things, I looked at various recommendations regarding this biopsy. Most of these recommendations would say that it should be attempted. If you don't even attempt and do a Whipple's procedure and God forbid it comes out to be, say, chronic pancreatitis or a lipoma over there or something or the other, it becomes very difficult to convince these patients. And you can just smile and say that I'm very happy that nothing has come out and you're very lucky or something of that sort. but at times it becomes a very difficult kind of a situation. I think an attempt at biopsy should be done. If it comes as benign and you are convinced that patient needs a Whipple's procedure, then you have to sit down with the patient, tell him all the pros and cons, and to convince him that it might come out as negative also. And I think that would be a exercise which is in your favor, in favor of the patient to accept it also.
Okay. Valid point, sir. So there is a question from Shikhar, who has asked, what's the role of diagnostic laparoscopy in periampullary carcinoma?
Yes, this is an important question. I forgot to include this slide. All the talk was also getting longer. So I think periampullary carcinoma, the yield of staging laparoscopy may be less. So we would do it only selectively. I think, Nikhil, you must be also following the same thing. That means in patients where either the CA19-9 is very much raised or disease looks advanced on imaging, in these patients, we may do a staging laparoscopy. But here also, or if there's a doubtful kind of lesion on, say, CT imaging or PET scan, then also we'll do a staging laparoscopy. Routinely, we would not do in periampullary carcinoma.
Sir, I agree with your approach, but generally, like we have moved on to doing diagnostic lab in almost all cases. Almost all cases of cancers.
In private sector, there is another problem of adding cost to the patient. This again is another issue when your yield is less and the cost of this would be added to all the patients, it becomes a little difficult. Plus, many of the times we would be in any case going ahead with kind of a bypass or so. So in those cases also it can be omitted.
I totally agree. I wouldn't disagree with that. I just said that, made an observation that we have moved on to, we generally do diagnostic lab in all our
I think
cases.
we can ask Dr. Bhojwani to spell out his approach as well over here.
Yeah, so sir, I would agree with you, Mishra sir. I mean, we do it very selectively, wherein we suspect that the chances of metastasis of small liver disease or the peritoneal disease are high, particularly patients with say pancreatic carcinoma with a very high CA19-9 up to say 800, 900,000. Therein we would probably go in with a staging laparoscopy, not a diagnostic laparoscopy, and rule out a metastatic disease. But having said that, I think with time, and similarly in private sector, it adds to the cost. It adds to, I mean, of course, non-yielding cases. The proportion is perhaps getting of these positive staging laparoscopies is getting less and less with improved imaging. These days, the CT scans are good, and wherever you have a high risk of metastasis, many patients do ask for a PET scan. So you have a PET scan, you have a very high quality imaging. And then also, if you do not have high risk factors like, say, very high molecular markers, we would probably not like to go in for a staging laparoscopy and straight away proceed, because again, all the same, we proceed with a palliative bypass in patients who are not otherwise resectable or found unresectable on the table. Because in our setting, by and large, the cost of palliative bypass is not very high if you compare it to, say, a SEMS or something. And because
Okay, I mean we can. So there is more questions from audience, and the question is, when should dunking be done? Dr. Mishra, sir.
If you ask me, never. I don't do this. So, but yes, this is also a valid anosmosis, and you have been doing dunking and you have good results. You can proceed ahead. So, I do not do dunking, and I had learned dunking at the time of my residency days. I found it to be not very good procedure, and we had very high leak rates. So therefore, I have switched to Bloom-Gart's and osmosis, and it is serving me well. So I don't do dunking.
Yeah.
But yes, two cases we had done dunking in our series. That was when we could not simply identify the duct. At that times, we had done dunking. If the duct is very small or soft pancreas, probably some people may advocate that dunking be done.
If I add a question here, sir, in such cases, you would want to do a dunking or a PG?
See, PG versus PJ debate has been going on, and I think we should be dunking this debate somewhere or dumping this
I
debate.
have a specific instance, sir. In cases, I'm not questioning PJ versus PG. I understand that that is a big debate. So I'm asking a very specific question: PJ dunking versus PG.
PJ dunking versus PG. I would say that as far as literature scan is concerned, PG dunking might be a little better than PJ dunking.
Exactly. So that's what I have done in couple of cases. The way you said that there has only been one or two instances.
Another method described as partition stomach, dunking into the partitioned stomach. So that is another procedure which has been described, and it has said that it would further kind of improve the outcomes, because that would be separated like partitioned stomach.
Now,
But
since we are getting late,
I have no personal experience of this.
Yeah. We'll take one quick question before we move on to panel. So the question is from Rahul, and he's asking, should we do staging lab before initiating neoadjuvant therapy routinely, or does a PET scan alone would suffice?
Till now, our approach has been PET scan and go ahead. There is a point that surface metastasis, peritoneal metastasis can be missed by PET scan, but we will settle with that.
Yeah. Dr. Bhojwani, you would agree?
Yeah, I think by and large, I would agree. I mean, that's our practice also.
So I think now we can move on to panel discussion, and Manish will please take it forward.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nikhil. And I welcome to all eminent panelists over here for a panel discussion. We have with us Dr. P.K. Mishra, who has already delivered a very beautiful lecture on periampullary carcinoma, all basic aspects. We have Dr. Rajesh Bhojwani. He's a senior surgeon from SDMH Jaipur. Dr. Shilpa Prabhu Desai, she is on pathologist from Center for Oncopathology, Mumbai. Dr. Safalta, she is medical oncologist from BL Kapoor. And Dr. Anchal Agarwal, she is a radiation oncologist from Patel Hospital, Jalandhar. So let me share my screen first. One second. So is my screen visible?
Yeah.
Okay. I welcome to all the panelists. So let us first discuss, let me introduce the topic first, like periampullary carcinoma, why this topic actually requires a separate webisode other than pancreatic malignancy or borderline pancreatic malignancy. As Dr. Mishra has already mentioned, it is a entity which comprises of 4 anatomical type of tumors: duodenal, ampullary, distal bile duct, and pancreatic malignancy within 1 or 2 centimeter from the ampulla. Recently, we have seen that there is new classification on histological type, which we will discuss in our further slides: pancreaticobiliary type, intestinal type, and mixed type based on immunohistochemistry markers. So this malignancy, initially, whatever scans, whatever studies has been done, or there was like heterogeneous kind of patients, including all pancreatic head malignancy as well as periampullary carcinoma. If we take all these trials taking into account, like all aspect one trial or previous aspect trials except aspect 3 trial. So mostly trials are taking periampullary carcinoma and pancreatic malignancy together, and mostly the results of these trials are extrapolated to periampullary malignancy. However, what we have seen and what now many parts of the world, many centers have now seen that the 5-year survival, if we see, it is better overall. It is better for periampullary malignancy. It is in periampullary malignancy also, it is better for ampullary lesions, 37 to 51%. For bile duct malignancy, it is around 30%. And for duodenal cancer, again, it is better, 25 to 59 lesions. We'll try to understand why this is so. And like primary ampullary cancers are those which typically arises from ampulla of Witter. And recently studies have found that their origin is more towards intestinal type rather than pancreaticobiliary type. That's why maybe that is a reason that their prognosis is better. So let me first begin with our case. So he was a 50-year-old gentleman. He presented to us with complaints of jaundice, pruritus, and intermittent fever for last 1 month. And on initial evaluation, he was fit, absolutely otherwise fit. ECOG 1, moderately built, nutrition was well maintained, and he walked into OPD with. And on examination, there was icterus. No other significant finding was there. Ultrasound report was suggestive of gallbladder was distended. CBD was dilated till lower end with bilateral IHBRD. There was no mass lesion or any other significant finding mentioned on ultrasound. So we took a detailed history. Further details was like that: fever history, it was like 1 or 2 episodes in a week, 99 to 100 degree Fahrenheit, last for around 1 to 2 hours, sometimes associated with chills, not always. He used to took paracetamol for that, and 1 course of oral antibiotic also he took. And last fever episode was like 5 days back, and there was no history of any intervention like ERCP or biopsy done. On further evaluation, hemoglobin was 11 gram %, total counts was 6,000, He was running, he was having intermittent fever, procalcitonin was normal, urine RM, urine CS was normal, blood culture normal, renal function test was normal. LFT was showing total bilirubin of 10 with direct of 7.3, mildly raised enzymes 78 and 112, and albumin was normal 3.2. CT was done, it was showing small periampullary growth with upstream dilatation of bile duct. PD was 5 mm, no evidence of any pancreatitis. So this was a small periampullary mass and side view endoscopy. Ampullary growth was there and biopsy was taken. It was suggestive of moderately differentiated adenocarcinoma. Tumor markers CA 99.9 was 87, CA was 12. So can I ask our panelists like Dr. Bhojwani, can you please tell us how will you proceed in such kind of cases where patient is having actually history of fever? Means how do you actually proceed in these kind of cases?
Yeah, so I see the patient has fever, which means obviously he's getting intermittent kind of cholangitis, but you have very nicely presented the characteristics of his fever profile. He's getting a spike in about once in 5 to 7 days, and the counts are also normal. The PCT is also normal. So that
Yes.
suggests that it is not a very bad toxic cholangitis or something which can progress to toxic cholangitis or something which can interfere with the results of the procedure. And therefore, with this patient who has a bilirubin of 10 and a clearly resectable disease, which is biopsy proven,
Yes.
I think I would not like to stent him and go at directly resection.
Right. So, any Dr. Mishra, do you have any difference of opinion in this case?
I think fair statement by Dr. Bhojwani, and I think the approach is absolutely correct. And in fact, this is a very good life kind of a situation that we
Yes.
there are no clear-cut answers for these things, and by and large we evaluate. Now in this patient, TLC is normal, procalcitonin is normal, patient is afebrile for last 5 days. I think we will proceed ahead.
We can proceed.
We'll explain to the patient.
Right. So, like already Dr. Mishra has mentioned in his slides, like cholangitis is one of the indication for stenting, but yes, we have to see patient in as a whole, and including all extensive investigation. It is not showing any, it is low grade cholangitis maybe, but not showing like toxic features. So we can proceed with surgery. And Dr. Bhojwani, will you like, would you like to give any pre-operative antibiotic or any other different preparation would you like to do in these cases, or just work up from OPD and directly admit 1 day prior to surgery?
Yeah, that's what we do. I mean, we work up completely on the outdoor basis and then admit them 1 day prior to surgery.
Okay.
And we always give them a pre-operative antibiotic, which is swallowed for the next 5 days, unless there are indications for a prolonged this thing. And we always procure a bile sample for culture, which might be choice of antibiotics too.
Intraoperatively. Right. So intraoperatively, what will be your in periampullary carcinoma particularly? What will be your surgical approach? Whipple's operation. What kind of Whipple's operation do you prefer? Classical Whipple's.
We have been doing PPPD for the last quite a few years. Yeah.
Right. So any role of like there is another surgery which is known as antrum preserving or subtotal stomach preserving pancreaticoduodenectomy. Do you think that can also be done for these cases?
Yeah. See, that can be done, but what I have realized in the last, I would say 4 to 5 years, when we have started doing PPPD, that if you do a good and nice PPPD, the delayed gastric emptying is not all that much. By and large, as we all understand, and we all know, it is all related to the pancreatic fistula or a leak if it is there, that causes delayed gastric emptying in many of these cases. By and large, I strongly believe it is not the procedure which can add to the magnitude or the incidence of delayed gastric emptying. And therefore, for me, unless there is a reason, I would not probably go and do an antrum preserving or a stomach preserving pancreaticoduodenectomy. I would rather go in for a PPPD or a classical Whipple's. Suppose it's a duodenal carcinoma or a very bulky head which is rent to the antropyloric region. I would rather prefer to do a classical approach.
Classical.
Yeah.
Right. So for the benefit of the students, like standard PD, as we already know, dumping syndrome is classically described as more in standard PD versus PPPD, post-operative alkali reflux and weight loss. These for these complications, only PPPD was popularized, but it was found to have increased incidence of DG, which is now, as Dr. Bhojwani has already mentioned, that like recent meta-analysis also has found that incidence of DG is same in classical PD as well as PPPD, pylorus preserving. And this subtotal stomach preserving pancreaticoduodenectomy, it was described with an advantage of having less DG as compared to pylorus preserving, because there is no pyloric ring or duodenum denervated pyloric ring, which may be a reason for DG, which was proposed to be as a reason for DG. And problems of ulceration then are higher in this due to retained antrum. And we have these data also, meta-analysis of standard versus pylorus preserving showed no difference DG, no difference in lymph nodal yield, tumor recurrence, or overall survival for periampullary carcinoma. And for subtotal stomach preserving, no overall difference in median survival. So we can do any of these procedures. So Dr. Mishra, can I ask you, you mentioned in one or two of your slides the extent of lymphadenectomy. So what is the standard lymphadenectomy for a Whipple's procedure in periampullary carcinoma? So,
see, the standard lymphadenectomy that we would do is to the right of the SMA. We will remove all the lymph nodes. So some people do extended to 14A, 14B, like, and 17 also. So, but basically, we would remove all the lymph nodes to the right of the SMA, and that is the standard lymphadenectomy that we do.
right.
One more thing that I would say about your last patient, that in that kind of a scenario where subclinical cholangitis is there, but the patient has improved, two things I would do a little differently compared to our standard. One is that ensure that we get a bile culture done at the time of the operation, and possibly use a higher end antibiotic, either Tazac or meropenem in such a case.
Right. So point well taken. So this is the group of lymph nodes which was described by Japan Pancreas Society. As we can see in this diagram, these group of lymph nodes are suprapyloric, infrapyloric 5, 6, then 12 A, B, C. C is around the cystic duct, A, B, artery, bile duct, and 8A, 8B superiorly and posteriorly to the common hepatic artery. Again, then 13A and 13B is anterior, posterior, superior, and inferior to the pancreas head. And then 17A and B again superiorly and inferiorly on the anterior surface of the pancreas. And then we have a controversy around 14A, B, C, and D. 14A, B, and C are on the right side of the supramesenteric artery, so these groups have to be removed. So, but defining like what is standard lymphadenectomy, we have there are in literature we have four randomized controlled trials we can see from 1998 to 2012, which last trial was done by Japanese. And if you can see the trial which was done in Japan, actually the standard lymphadenectomy, actually they did not included any of the group other than 13 and 17, which means just the lymph nodes on the superior, on the inferior and superior aspect of the pancreatic head. So they have not cleared the HDL also in standard lymphadenectomy, and it was randomized. All four were randomized controlled trials, and the definition of standard lymphadenectomy was different in all these trials. So to avoid this confusion, and all these trials actually showed no difference in survival when we do extended lymphadenectomy. But what is exactly standard lymphadenectomy? It was defined by SGPS consensus, as told by Dr. Mishra. Everything on the right side of the SMA we have to remove. So 5, 6, 8A, 12B, C, 13A, 14, ABC, and 17A and B. So all these group of lymph nodes on the right side of SMA, we have to remove as a standard lymphadenectomy in periampullary carcinoma. So Dr. Bhojwani, one question which always troubles us: should we routinely resect para-aortic lymph node, particularly station 16B1, inferior to left renal vein?
See, I don't do it routinely, and unless it is seen on the preoperative scan. And I would see when I do it is usually a duodenal carcinoma which has shown it preoperatively. Now, unless suspected preoperatively, I won't go there and do it.
Right.
Do you guys do? Do you guys do?
So we have evidence for that. So these are the studies where para-aortic lymph node involvement in pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma, whenever it is involved and whenever surgery was done, survival was inferior. These are the studies. But what about periampullary carcinoma? Periampullary carcinoma, we have one study which was published in BJS 2004, which showed that actually 16B1 lymph node, positive 16B1 lymph node, did not have any effect on survival. However, in this study, one finding was noticed that station 8A lymph node, which is superior to common hepatic artery, if it is involved, it is found to be changing the prognosis. And there are many cadaveric studies also where they found that 16B1 lymph node, particularly from duodenal malignancy, as you rightly mentioned, they found that there are direct lymphatic channels which is draining into 16B1 lymph node in 5 of the patients out of 15 they studied. So that can be one of the reasons why 16B1 in these kind of tumors may not change the prognosis. So this is the recent paper which was published by Netherlands group again. So what they did, this is a very interesting paper which was published in Annals of Surgical Oncology 2020. This was a retrospective multicentric cohort study. So cohort A was routine para-aortic lymph node sampling in all periampullary carcinomas. Frozen section was done. If frozen is found to be positive, they will not proceed to pancreaticoduodenectomy. They will do only double bypass. And cohort B was all patients underwent pancreaticoduodenectomy. No routine intraoperative sampling of para-aortic lymph node was done. Para-aortic lymph node was routinely harvested and examined post-operatively. So these two things they compared in their study. So cohort A was 288 patients and cohort B was 200 patients. In cohort A, 186 patients sampling was done. Out of which 34 patients PLN was found to be positive, around 18%. And similarly in cohort B, where pancreaticoduodenectomy was done, post-operatively it was found to be positive in around 19%, 18.7. So almost similar. And what they found that in cohort A, all these cases are only periampullary carcinomas. So median overall survival was 7 months. Median overall survival in cohort B was 11 months. So what they concluded is like a significant patient with PLN metastasis who underwent PD had significantly increased post-operative morbidity compared to patients who underwent double bypass operations. That is obvious. But the reason for on multivariate analysis, the reason for this increased morbidity, they found that severe comorbidities was one of the independent predictor factors. So there was increased survival if we do pancreaticoduodenectomy, even if PLN is positive in periampullary carcinoma. And when they added adjuvant chemotherapy, they even increased the survival by 2 months. So, and what ISGPS recommendation is there? This study got published in 2020, but this ISGPS recommendation came in like 6 years before this thing. So in their recommendation also, there is no consensus which could be reached on station B1 actually. And when lymph node station 16B is found to be positive during operation, most members of the consensus conference would continue with resection. Deciding to abandon resection or to continue the procedure should also depends on other variables such as comorbidity, age of the patient, local ingrowth of tumor into main vessels, or markedly increased CA 99.9 preoperatively.
Dr. Manish, can I say one thing?
Yes,
that we need to look at our own data also.
Yes,
18% para-aortic lymph node positivity in patients of periampullary is a very, very high figure. I need to look at our own data.
Yes, sir.
Whether that would be the, in fact, lymph node positivity itself is there in say about 30% or so, and para-aortic being positive in about 18%, I would have my doubts, but we are not sending separately the station lymph nodes from the para-aortic routinely, but
Okay.
we can
So,
send.
so you have, so
sorry,
you already showed one your publication from GP Pant Hospital about periampullary carcinoma about the lymph nodes. So can you share us the means with us?
mentioned. I think it was a slip of a tongue from Dr. Manish. This is about pancreatic head cancer and not
No,
periampullary.
no,
You can see it is written. It is pancreatic head cancer.
no. It is so. This is for periampullary carcinoma.
Periampullary.
So
But
this is only means like now Dutch, particularly in the Netherlands, what they have recognized is like periampullary carcinoma is they are doing a lot of work there. Means 3-4 publications recently they have published.
But
and
their periampullary carcinomas are by and large pancreatic origin
Yes,
carcinomas.
definitely. So definitely, so we have difference
About
in
60% are
from West versus in our country. So
right.
most of the papers which are there from our country, your paper, ILBS paper, and from the papers from the south, we have more ampullary malignancy, but their
Yes, sir.
paper, all their papers have more pancreatic malignancy as a component of periampullary carcinoma.
Correct.
So this difference I have noticed.
Dr. Manish, excuse me, and Dr. Shilpa here.
Yes.
That,
Yes.
Currently, what is the thinking on para-aortic lymph nodes? Does it make it, if positive, does it become M1 or does it add to the nodal status? Isn't it a metastatic site?
So it is considered as metastatic for pancreatic malignancy, definitely for head of the pancreas. But for but if we go through the consensus statements of ISGPS, there is no consensus statement on that. Means we have to take into account the other factors of the patient, like what is the ASA grade, what are the local tumor factors, like if it is clearly resectable periampullary small growth with the para-aortic lymph node, then means the consensus statement is that we can go ahead with resection of these para-aortic lymph nodes also.
Yes, it was said that they have the same prognosis as the lymph node positive variety.
Yes.
So should it be a part of the standard lymphadenectomy?
So they have not included in a standard lymphadenectomy. They have means covered it under the extended lymphadenectomy. So what they have found is like if PLN is positive, then definitely the prognosis is bad as compared to negative PLN. But definitely it is better than if we don't do anything. And there is
point is
yes, and we
lymphadenectomy pre-operatively. How do you decide upon it when to do extended? That will be the issue.
So the one answer for that can be like if we suspect para-aortic lymph node on table, then we can do frozen. If frozen is positive, then we can, and if it is resectable, other factors are also feasible, patient's general condition and other things. Then on that basis, we can take a decision of doing PLND.
Yeah. So I think we are boiling down to the same consensus here also. So
yes.
If you have seen it preoperatively on imaging, on a good quality imaging,
yes, sir.
that probably becomes one indication to sample it and send it for frozen, depending on whatever is your philosophy, I think.
Yes. So one more thing I would like to ask from you, like if preoperatively, if you see like PLN node is there, would you like to do any kind of preoperative biopsy, any kind of means either US or something?
Not when it is pancreatic or periampullary. I'm sure the further movement will differ if it is a carcinoma gallbladder, because that's a different ball game. But when contemplating a periampullary or a pancreatic resection,
yes,
I think I would not. I would rather remove the entire thing, and if it is seen beforehand, or once in a while, if it is not seen and palpated on the table, I would like to resect it out and send it for histopathology and be
right. So US may not be feasible in these kind of
Dr.
scenarios.
Manish,
yes,
should I say something? We can have an alternate approach also, depending on what the condition of patient is. Like if it is positive preoperatively on a PET scan,
yes, sir.
then probably we should subject this patient to neoadjuvant kind of thing.
Definitely.
And then resect.
Definitely, sir. Definitely, this approach is feasible.
This is another feasible alternative, and I think the decision will have to be.
Yes, sir. Definitely, this is one of the alternative. But as of now, I cannot produce any kind of paper which is there on this kind of approach. Definitely, there are many papers which suggest neoadjuvant chemotherapy in even in resectable pancreatic malignancies. So in these patients, definitely neoadjuvant therapy can be given. This is another topic of discussion. So let's move on. Let's move on to another aspect of surgery, which is again Dr. Mishra has mentioned in his slides. Dr. Bhojwani, you can better tell us the role of minimal invasive surgery, particularly laparoscopic pancreatectomy, when you deal with such kind of small periampullary lesions.
See, I think Dr. Mishra sir has very adequately and very comprehensively and precisely stated the status of minimal acne at the moment. And we have had a significant experience with minimal access pancreatic surgery. I think we've now done 29 laparoscopic Whipples, but many more distal pancreatic tail resections and body resections, distal pancreatectomies, median pancreatectomies. Having had that experience and other experience of HPV with laparoscopy, see, the bottom line is that these all surgeries, the primary determinant of your result is the outcome, as sir has already mentioned. So there is no way you can compromise on the outcome of your surgical procedure. I'm talking about the short-term outcome in terms of morbidity or hospital stay or whatever. Having said that, we also understand that the results or the short-term outcomes are also a function of the volume at every center.
Yes.
Now, to have a volume of laparoscopic pancreaticoduodenectomy at one center in a country like India, in the settings that we have, whether it is government sector or private sector, it's not easy. See, for a center to kind of replicate the results of open pancreaticoduodenectomy, if laparoscopic is contemplated as a routine procedure, it will require about 100 procedures a year.
Yes, you rightly mentioned. Yes, you rightly mentioned.
Yeah, would mean you should have at least about 4 surgeons who are as good with their skills and experience in laparoscopic HPV surgery, because you cannot expect a single person to do 100 laparoscopic Whipples. It takes about 7 hours.
Yes.
That's a bit constraint in our setting.
Right. So you have rightly mentioned that there is a big learning curve for this procedure, and this was again observed in this very famous one of the negative trial, Leopard 2 trial, which was again published by Dutch Pancreatic Cancer Group. And in phase 2 of this trial, only 42 patients were randomized, and there were 3 deaths out of 20 patients in laparoscopic group versus no death in open group. And out of total, they found that after randomizing total of around 97 patients, they found that there was 10% mortality in laparoscopic group in comparison 2% in open. And Clevin-Dindo grade 3 complications were also higher, even means in laparoscopic group. However, the grade B and C pancreatic fistula, which was higher in both the series, like 28% in laparoscopic group and 24% in open group. It was higher in both the groups actually, but that was comparable. So this trial was prematurely closed in view of safety concerns, and now. And in this trial, actually, it was a multicentric trial, and all surgeons were trained. They had an experience of at least 20 laparoscopic Whipples. But now the studies are going on about the again what is the adequate training should be there for attempting the laparoscopic Whipples. So now coming to this histopathology of this patient. This patient underwent open Whipples operation, and the histopathology of this patient was periampullary carcinoma arising from the duodenum with invasion of pancreas up to 0.5 centimeter. It was a poorly differentiated adenocarcinoma. Signet ring cells were seen with extracellular mucin. Size was 2 into 1 into 1 centimeter. Margins were all free. And 4 out of 27 nodes were positive. EC was positive. Lymphovascular invasion was there. Perineural invasion was not there. Intra-aortocaval lymph nodes we routinely sample, and it was all found to be negative. We don't do frozen section for intra-aortocaval lymph nodes for periampullary carcinoma. So Dr. Shilpa, can I please ask you, so how do you differentiate ampullary malignancy invading pancreas or vice versa? Means both things can be there, like pancreatic head malignancy going into ampulla and invading into ampulla causing blockage there, or it can be an ampullary malignancy with or a duodenal malignancy going into the pancreas. So how do you differentiate these things on histopathology?
So on gross examination, if the tumor is an early stage tumor, then gross examination can give us some findings, you know, like whether it is an intra-ampullary tumor or whether we are seeing it on the duodenal surface of the ampulla. And then if it is like a fungating or an exophytic growth, even the location of the ampulla as we see can give us a clue. If the ampulla looks eccentric, then it is likely to be a periampullary duodenal kind of tumor. But more often than not, I have seen advanced stage tumors which are, you know, going into the pancreas as well. And in these kind of tumors, one would have to think of where the epicenter is, and a lot of times you're not able to really classify, and then you have to say
Right.
that it is not.
So can we actually differentiate between these malignancy on histopathology alone?
On histopathology, yes, depending on the type of morphology that we are seeing. And in this, I speak of the tumors where you see gland formation or tubule formation. So if it resembles the intestinal type or whether it resembles a pancreaticobiliary type. So that can be
Right.
one clue to support one over the other. And then immunohistochemistry is playing a role these days. And nowadays it is believed that the subtype is more important than the exact location of
Yes, that's why now mostly we have shifted from anatomical classification to the histological classification.
Right.
So and another thing which I would like to ask you,
Yes.
like this is very important topic from pathology point of view,
Yes.
about the grossing technique for particularly for periampullary carcinoma.
Yes.
So as we know, there are two grossing techniques, axial slicing and bivalving technique. So what do you suggest? Means what is your opinion regarding these two techniques?
The proponents of each have things to say in favor of these techniques. Now, where the bivalving is really helpful is that it allows you to study the entire length of the pancreatic and the CBD. So
can you, for the benefit of the students, can you just elaborate slightly on these techniques?
May I show? Can I share my screen? I just have a couple of images.
Yeah, definitely. For that, I have to stop.
2-3 minutes. Yeah.
1 second.
I'll just try.
Okay, I will. Yeah, please.
Are you able to?
Yes, we can. We are able to see.
Okay, so these are just some images that I've taken from a explanatory article which is targeted for surgical pathologists. So this is how a pathologist should orient this specimen, and this here is the pancreatic neck cut margin. Actually, if you peer closely, I mean, which we do when we look at the specimen, you can see the lobulations of the pancreatic parenchyma. And this is what is the uncinate or the retroperitoneal cut margin, which is a much bigger and a little bulging kind of a structure. And here within, remember I told you that this is the neck. Here you can see these vague lobulations also of the pancreatic parenchyma. And here we can see the pancreatic duct. Now the duct may not always be seen when we get the specimen. At such times, we give these really thin cuts which can expose the lumen of the duct, because this duct is quite small and sometimes it gets hidden. And the common bile duct is seen better because it has a larger lumen, so it is more evident for us. And this and the other thing that we do is cut the duodenum along the anti-ampullary border, so that we are not disturbing the ampulla and we can take a look at the exact location. Now the margins which we sample are the duodenal or the gastric as maybe the proximal one, the distal one, the pancreatic neck margin, and then on the posterior aspect, the retroperitoneal margin. And then there are these surfaces. Now, whether you call them margin or a surface, the anterior and the posterior surface of the pancreas. So we do this by inking it in different colors so that under the microscope, we can see the color and we do not get confused about what we are looking at. And one good way of studying the margin is by inking it, like I said, depending on the color we choose. And then we, kind of lop off a slice of it and then make perpendicular sections. So what this does is that this is the margin. And suppose one were to see a tumor coming up to here. It tells us exactly how much clearance is there between the surgical plane of resection and the tumor. Whereas if you were just to put this face down, we can just say positive or negative. We cannot say the exact clearance. So this is a good way of sampling the pancreatic margins. And this is what you were talking about, Dr. Manish, the axial way of cutting, which is one goes perpendicular. And even here you get a lot of information. Actually, this is the technique that I follow and my colleagues also like to follow. So here what we do is we open the duodenum along here, study the ampullary region, and then we go this way. So you get the ampullary region, the wall of the duodenum, the pancreas, and the ducts. Now this is in contrast with what is the bivalving, and this is how beautifully in a well bivalved specimen one can see the pancreatic duct and the common bile duct, which is a larger duct, I told you. And so if there's an abnormality, like here the tumor is here, it seems to be in relationship with the pancreatic duct. So that is seen better in a bivalve specimen. So, but the opinion is still divided on what is the correct way. There are very strong proponents of either things. So
can I share my screen now? Yes. So yes, you rightly mentioned that bivalving technique actually allows us for better tumor localization, particularly for periampullary malignancies. Yes, but axial slicing, it came into existence after this very famous landmark paper, which was Leeds pathology protocol. As you rightly mentioned, multicolor margin staining, axial slicing, and extensive tissue sampling. And they found that R1 resection margin was better, actually was more found when it was done in this way. And they found that their pathology specimens was having pancreatic malignancies, particularly head of pancreas, particularly it was about 85% R1 resection margin. If they go according to Leeds pathology protocol, for ampullary it was less of a concern. R1 resection margin 4 out of 15 patients, and bile duct it was 6 out of 13 patients. And this is another recently published randomized control trial on these two techniques, axial slicing versus bivalving technique. They have taken into account all these factors which we have already discussed: primary tumor identification, R1 resection margin, lymph nodal yield. And they found that in these two techniques, whether it is done for pancreatic malignancy or periampullary carcinoma, there is no actual difference which is found in this randomized controlled trial. It is recently published again from the Dutch Pancreatic Cancer Group, and this year only they have published.
But
So,
one criticism of the axial slicing method is that some people believe that lymph node counting may be a problem, and one may count the same lymph node again. But I think in the hands of an experienced,
that's why in previous studies actually lymph nodal yield was found to be higher, but actually it was, yes, you rightly mentioned that lymph node can be counted number of times. Same lymph node can be counted. So what is the role of IHC? Means we'd like to understand from you what is the role of IHC in identifying
the type of histological markers that we should do are 3, which are commonly available in most labs, is CK20, CDX2, which are commonly positive in an intestinal phenotype, whereas the pancreatic would have the CK7 and they would have EMA, or what is called MUC1. So that would suggest a pancreaticobiliary phenotype. Yes. So just doing those is enough.
Okay. So now normally what we see like ampullary and duodenal type of malignancies are mostly intestinal type, and distal CBD and pancreatic are pancreaticobiliary type on ISC. So CK7, if it is strongly positive and weak CK20 or CDX2, then it is pancreaticobiliary type. If it is strongly CK20 or CDX2 and weak CK7, then it is intestinal type. And if it is both ways, actually, then it is mixed type. So in our case, it was intestinal type of malignancy. So Dr. Safalta, so how important is IHC actually to know IHC for you to decide the further adjuvant treatment for this patient?
Right now, like the present guideline says, whatever it is, intestinal or pancreatobiliary type, the adjuvant chemotherapy is same. But recently there is food for thought that if the patient is having intestinal type, they should be treated like a small intestine or colon type, because these patients, they totally differ in prognosis from pancreatobiliary type. Like KRAS mutation, which is in 90% in pancreatobiliary type, it will be only 30% in intestinal type. So IHC is very important for us, both for prognosis. Intestinal type is having good prognosis, and second, to decide about which regime to be given.
So do you have difference in, like, as a first line, if you want to choose something, what will be your preferred chemotherapy for this patient?
In this
Or would you
patient,
like, and another thing means we'll also include Dr. Achal also here now, means is there any role of radiation also in these cases? Like if we have to decide adjuvant treatment now as a tumor board, so what will, because this patient had 4 out of 27 lymph nodes positive with EC
Lymph node
present.
positivity.
Yes. So what is the opinion regarding the radiation?
Actually, yeah, this patient, Dr. Manish, is 50-year-old with good performance status, and lymph node positivity is there with ECE and LVI. Though IHC is showing intestinal type, which is good prognosis, but current guidelines like give you mixed opinion. Like we can give adjuvant treatment, chemoradiation in this patient on the basis of lymph node positivity. Though we know like these patients are going to do better as they are intestinal type, but as such guidelines or NCCN, they do not incorporate, and there is no NCCN on intestinal type, or like we have no
Yes,
recommendation.
we don't have we don't have data for adding radiation based on IAC. Yes,
Yeah.
So Dr.
Yeah.
Safar, means what is your opinion regarding adding radiation in these kind of settings?
first of all, this patient will be treated as a duodenal carcinoma, intestinal type duodenal carcinoma. So there
Yes.
is no role of radiation in duodenal carcinoma as such. And here this patient is having lymph node positivity, LVI positivity, and ECE positivity. This patient will definitely require adjuvant chemotherapy, and that will be FOLFOX based chemotherapy, which we do.
Okay, so oxaliplatin you would like to add now only.
Yes, actually, adjuvant treatment is given in this when we consider it as having higher risk factors. In that case, I'll
Right.
give FOLFOX.
You will prefer FOLFOX. Okay.
Yes.
So
And like aspect trial, we in all the basically radiation is given from the Americans, while Europeans, they don't give radiation in the periampullary carcinomas. In
Yeah.
fact, with the R1 resections and even with lymph node positivity, they don't give radiation. So these patients will do well with adjuvant chemotherapy.
Yeah.
Rightly mentioned. So we just take into some of the literature. So actually it started in 2011. What we know before 2011 was like the trial on adjuvant chemotherapy was CONCORD trial, which used single agent gemcitabine, and ABC trial. ABC trial was basically on advanced diseases. They used gemcitabine plus cisplatin, and this trial included primary ampullary cancers, around 20 patients. So that's what I mentioned earlier, like all the previous trials had heterogeneous group of patients. And what happened, like in 2012, from the MD Anderson Cancer Center, one study was published. They actually, in the ESCO, they published 2 studies. The first study was on the histopathological types of periampullary carcinoma based on gene expression analysis. It was a small study of 32 patients, where actually they found that there can be 3 types: pancreatic, biliary, and intestinal type. and statistical significant difference in relapse-free survival and overall survival favoring the intestinal type of subgroup over biliary type. They found in one of their study, and another study from the same group, same author, he found that in a 42 patients that he compared gemcitabine versus 5-FU based chemotherapy. So what his observation was, ampullary carcinoma. Now we can think of a reason that ampullary carcinoma behaves more like intestinal type. So ampullary carcinoma patients who were treated with 5-FU based therapy showed statistical significant improvement in clinical outcomes, superior median time to progression, and a trend toward better median overall survival of 16 months versus 12.7 months. So now we can think of like ampullary carcinoma is more like an intestinal type. So that can be a reason that it responded well to 5-FU. And like Dr. Safalta said, that FOLFOX is a regime of choice in these kind of patients. And aspect 3 trial, one of the panelists mentioned, like aspect 3 is particularly done for periampullary carcinoma, when it was realized that periampullary carcinoma is a separate entity. And they actually did a multi-centric trial. It was a multinational, multi-centric trial in almost 100 centers of Europe, Australia, Japan, and Canada. Of the 428 patients, 297 had ampullary cancers, 96 had biliary duct cancer, 35 had other cancers. So 3 groups were there: observation, 5-FU, and gemcitabine. And another shortcoming of this trial was like they divided the malignancy as per the anatomical origin, ampullary, bile duct, and other type. They also did the ISC, but treatment was not given according to the ISC. And they found, their observation was like patient survival according to the tumor type. Ampullary cancer, it was high, it was better than other types. And again, adjuvant treatment wise also, gemcitabine better than 5-FU, better than observation. So maybe pancreaticobiliary type of ampullary malignancy is more common there, but it was not mentioned in this trial. And other aspect trials, aspect 1 trial, which was particularly for chemoradiotherapy, it was found that it was not helpful. It is not reducing.
Actually, if we look, there is a lot of criticism of this trial because the radiation which was used was quite substandard. Like we do not follow.
In aspect 1 trial, in aspect 1 trial you are mentioning, right?
Yeah. All
yes,
the trials like which are
They-
showing all are retrospective mostly, and they have used older radiation techniques. They were
Older
not able to
radiation
give
techniques.
adequate.
That is one of the criticism of aspect 1 trial. And aspect 4 trial, as mentioned in previous slides by I think Dr. Mishra mentioned, but aspect 4 trial again is not particularly for periampullary carcinoma. It is a pancreatic malignancy. Some patients may be there, and that introduced the importance of adding capecitabine. So GemCap. So what is your take regarding GemCap actually for periampullary malignancy? Dr. Safalta.
GemCap is a good regimen and easily tolerable. So this is one of the choice. In pancreatobiliary malignancy, especially pancreatobiliary type, we have a choice like GemCap can be given, or we can consider for GemCis, and even FOLFIRINOX can be considered depending on the general condition of the patient, if the patient is medically fit.
So only for pancreaticobiliary type or intestinal type also we can use GemCap?
Intestinal type, yes, because it has capecitabine, so this can be used. But like if we consider what we usually do is we give FOLFOX, and if it is pancreatobiliary type, then we give GemCap. We don't have any data of using FOLFOX in intestinal type, but this is what is practiced.
Yes, so we don't have data actually to use it as a first line,
Yes.
but yes, definitely.
Yes.
Many centers are now practicing as per the immunohistochemistry type. But as per you, GemCap is also one of the good options.
Yes, it's a good regime. At ILBS, I had been giving it to many of my patients. In fact, most of the patients, because FOLFIRINOX data has recently coming up. But previously, when GemCap was there, I used to give this, and it is easily tolerable. Good regime.
Okay. So
I'm just so sorry to intervene, but I have a specific question, and I think this is the right time to ask that question. Now, with that FOLFIRINOX data coming in pancreatic cancer, is that intestinal versus pancreaticobiliary debate very relevant here?
See, actually, if we consider intestinal type as a good prognostic one, we generally don't go so aggressive with intestinal type. So with Folfox, that is good, uh, good enough, I think so. And Folfirinox to be considered for pancreatobiliary type. But yes, we don't have data for this thing. And if the patient is fit, a young 38, 40 years of age, then probably people may consider giving Folfirinox in those patients as well.
Yes. So moving forward, so Dr. Achal, can you please tell us how would you like to give radiation? What regime you follow for these periampullary malignancy if you have to give radiation for these patients?
Like I would be like pro for giving radiation in this young patient with good performance status. Since intestinal or pancreatic or biliary, like we do not have any recommendation whether we can omit or de-escalate therapy in those patients as such. So I would be using IMRT with conventional fractionation, 45 gray.
So it will be like a sandwich kind of a procedure, or
yeah, we will give adjuvant chemotherapy first, followed by chemoradiation, and then adjuvant whatever like medical.
I think this trial has mentioned about this sandwich regime RTOG N9704, where they actually combine gemcitabine along with 5-FU infusion given with radiation therapy, gemcitabine followed by 5-FU with radiation followed by again gemcitabine, and they found that in comparison to observation, definitely there was survival advantage, but we don't have data actually to compare neoadjuvant CTRT versus only chemotherapy. We have data from ASPEC-1 trial, but as Dr. Achal rightly mentioned, there were many shortcomings of that trial, particularly for the type of radiation therapy which was offered in that in that trial. And we have many retrospective studies from different part of the world, particularly for ampullary carcinoma for adjuvant chemoradiation. And one of the studies which I would like to mention is from India, Sikora et al. From SGPGI, where they analyzed 113 patients and they found actually no benefit. So we have studies which have shown, some studies have shown benefits, some studies have not shown any benefit.
Yeah, another study which was published in 2015 from PGI only.
Yes.
They have found out that there is a benefit of giving adjuvant chemoradiation, especially if the patient has node positivity and advanced T3, T4 patients. Like it was from PGI Chandigarh.
Okay. And I would like to ask you, like, and Dr. Safalta also, like adding radiation for R1 resection margin.
Yes.
In R1 resection margin, definitely we are inclined to give radiation. But yes, even in ASPEC-4, where there 64% of the patient in pancreatic head tumors, they were R1 resection, and they did not use radiotherapy. So yes, if there is young patient and fit for radiotherapy, I definitely will refer to radiation oncologist for this thing.
Yeah, actually, most of the patients either are going to have distant mix, and local regional control is also a problem. So that is why like they give systemic chemo first, followed by chemoradiation if we are planning to give that, followed by adjuvant chemo.
Right. So both are
Dr. Manish, can I ask one question? So
yes,
what is experience regarding if we give 4 cycles of gem, then go for radiation, and how difficult is to complete 2 more gem after radiation? So the toxicity,
that you can answer. That you can answer.
No, I want to ask other people also.
Actually, it is very difficult for the people after getting radiation in the abdomen to complete the other 2 cycles of chemotherapy. So what we used to do, even if we want to send the patient for radiation, we used to complete all the chemotherapy cycles and then to send for the radiation.
So that, as Dr. Safalta mentioned, like in ASPEC-3 trial, where they have given only adjuvant chemotherapy, they have not found, even for R1 resection patients also, they found that it was beneficial for even for R1 resected patients also. And Yes.
And
and
in
Dr. Achal
aspect
also-
4, it is like 80% of the patients were node positive and 64% patients were R1 resection.
Yes.
So people can go ahead without radiation, but yes, in our practice, what I do is like I definitely send whosoever the patient is having R1 resection, I do send the patient for radiotherapy.
So because of the lack of data of comparison between chemo versus chemo CTRT in
Yes.
these particular
Yes.
situations, we cannot extrapolate
Actually,
data
we
from-
can both ways. Like we can omit also, and we can give also. There is lot of data which is pro chemo radiation also, and there is lot of which is against also.
Yes.
So there is no
what
correct.
NCCN recommends right now is adding radiation for R1 section margins, but
Yes.
again we don't have any robust data for on this thing. So to summarize, like if I can say, so periampullary malignancy, surgical procedure is almost standard like in other head of pancreas malignancy, and whenever it is resectable, it should be resected. Para-aortic lymph node sampling or routine resection is not necessary if it is found to be doubtful node which is found to be positive intraoperatively. We can always do frozen section, and if frozen section is positive, patient is fit for surgery, no other comorbidities, and it is not a very advanced lesion, we can still go ahead with pancreaticoduodenectomy with para-aortic lymph node dissection, station B1 particularly. And regarding chemotherapy, now we have moved forward from anatomical classification to the histological classification, and still we don't have data, first line data for giving adjuvant chemotherapy based on ISC. Yes, now individual hospital series are coming up with the data of adding oxaliplatin as a first line whenever there is whenever ISC is suggestive of intestinal type of malignancy, as Dr. Safalta rightly mentioned, and there are few indications of radiation therapy as well. But again, we don't have any data for adding radiation therapy routinely. Few indications are particularly for positive resection margins, but yes, node positive patients, we don't have data. So still we cannot recommend this procedure. So I would, at this point, I would like to thank all my panelists for giving us time and give us a valuable opinion regarding this complex problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Manish. Thank you very much. You worked very hard. Thank you so much.
Yes, very good moderation. Thank you, Dr. Manish.
Yeah,
Thank
so indeed a very good discussion. We have come
Yes.
to certain conclusions and
I
very
did not know
elaborate.
what is the degree of his? I thought he's surgeon, then I thought he's pathologist, then I thought he's medical oncologist. He was thorough with
No, Dr.
That's it.
Manish is all in one. So
Yes.
in our tumor board, he more gives opinion about chemotherapy. Of course, surgery is his expertise. So we
Okay.
tend to gain opinions on chemotherapy also. So I
No, we cannot argue with our medical oncologist.
Manish, this is going to be used against you.
No, sir, we are never against him. It's very well, coordinated. So I really thank you all for a wonderful discussion, very elaborate. I think students definitely will get benefited. Thank you, Dr. Shilpa, for taking out time and joining, Dr. Achal, Dr. Safalta, Dr. Bhojwani. I really thank you all, and thank you, Mishra sir, for joining. And
Thank you so much.
none
Thanks.
other than Dr. Manish the Great. Thank you so much. And really, Dr. Nikhil, you want to say something for the next episode or so?
Thank you very much. Next episode, we still have to decide. So
Right. All right. So thank you all once again.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
good night. Bye bye.